Welcome to the show. My name is Bret, and you're on my channel. If this is your first time seeing anything about Docker here, then you're probably wondering what this is all about. So I do this weekly show on Thursdays, and today is Thursday, where I sometimes have guests, and I sometimes take Q&A for an entire hour on everything Docker, containers, Kubernetes, the cloud, anything related to DevOps, really, and sysadmin stuff. So get your questions in early because throughout the show, we'll be taking questions where we'll be here at least an hour, and eventually this will turn into a podcast. So let me just give you a heads up on all that stuff. First, over on my website, bretfisher.com/courses, you can get all the coupons for my courses, and we're getting close to releasing some new content on Kubernetes, which is pretty exciting. The way you can get notified of that is to sign up on my newsletter. That's bretfisher.com/newsletter. And you can see all that stuff and more at /Docker on my website. So there's a bunch of resources there. Some are free, some aren't. Some of my talks at conferences and stuff like that, DockerCon. And speaking of DockerCon, I have one of my friends on today. We have Elton Stoneman from Docker.
Hey, how you doing, folks? Thanks for joining us. Thanks for having me, Bret. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I'm super excited. We've been, we met like 3 or 4 years ago at DockerCon, I believe. And we've been jamming ever since. We've got similar backgrounds, and we both are huge fans of Docker. In fact, he was a Docker captain and then ended up working for Docker. And Docker captains are kind of like Microsoft MVPs. You can't both work for the company and be one of those at the same time.
Yeah, so, unfortunate.
Yeah, so he's in the alumni program. If we had one of those.
Yeah, I still get the swag, but I don't get.
That's right. You still get the swag, honorary swag. So let me tell you a little bit about Elton. If you're not aware, he has stuff all over the internet. So you've probably heard him or watched his stuff or read his stuff and didn't know it. He's an architect at Docker, a 10-time Microsoft MVP, which is really impressive. That's a decade of yearly MVP approvals. That's pretty great. He's a Pluralsight author, lots of courses there. We'll talk about those later. He's calling in today from Cotswold in the UK, and he's been doing Docker since the early days, the early releases. He's helped organizations for years now at every stage in their container journey, and he's been fortunate to travel the world speaking at conferences and running workshops, helping people learn Docker and what it can do for them. So thanks for being on the show.
Oh, Bret, thanks for reading out the intro that I wrote so nicely. It makes me sound really good.
I know, right? I actually like it when other people, like talking about yourself is harder than having someone else.
I mean, so that's why I had to defuse all those nice words by breaking in afterwards. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to do it myself. So when I introduce myself, I just say, "Hi, I'm Elton. I work for Docker."
Right. Which, I mean, yeah, because if you talk too long about yourself, people are like, okay, I get it. You know some things. Like, move along. And Americans are different at that. Like, we like to talk about ourselves. I think, British are definitely a little bit more humble, and I think that we could take some of that over here. All right, so in case you didn't all see like the words plastered everywhere, Elton, because he's been a Windows guy, I've been a Windows guy for so long. We both love Docker on Windows. Excuse me. And I happen to be on a Mac now, but it doesn't mean I don't have a closet with at least a dozen Windows machines running right now. I got Windows on my laptop running in VMs. And so Windows is everywhere. And a lot of my clients and a lot of our students, and the majority of the students, in fact, are on Windows. So I think that it's a topic that everyone's always interested in. How do we make Docker on Windows better? What are the new features on Windows? How does Windows Server work? And so we're going to go through that this whole hour. But first up, I feel like we need to back up and talk about where we are. Like, what's the current status? And I think we should talk about Windows 10 first, because I think the story is a little different on Windows Server. So what's if the release is today with the latest release of Docker Desktop, what's the experience like? What's the features?
Oh, so Docker Desktop on Windows is it's super because there are different flavors of containers. So the basic idea of a container is the process in the container runs natively on the host. That's just the basic idea. So I cannot take a container that's built to run on Linux and run it on Windows, because the file system is different. The CPU the way you talk at that level just doesn't work. I can't, and likewise, I can't take a container image that's got a Windows exe file in there and try and run it on Linux, because Linux doesn't know anything about exe files. So the primary thing is that when you build your package, your application, you're either going to package it to run on a Docker on Windows or Docker on Linux. And then what's special about Docker Desktop on Windows is that it supports both. So I can run native Windows containers. So I can take my old .NET applications, and and when you package up to run on Windows, there's kind of backward support to forever, pretty much. You got your Windows container can be based on Windows Server 2016, so you can 2019 or 2016, so it'll support pretty much everything that's out there. So you can take, and I've done this, you can literally take a 10-year-old .NET 2 application, package it up with the Docker file, and run it in a container on Windows Server 2019. And Windows 10 lets you do that, lets you run your Windows containers. But you can also flick a button on Docker Desktop, switch to Linux containers. Behind the scenes, it spins up a Hyper-V VM, which is running Linux. It points your Docker command line into the VM. It's all super slick. You don't have to get involved with it. It just works. And then you can run Linux containers and Windows containers. So it's a really neat way of getting started with that stuff.
Yeah, and I think recently the install for Docker Desktop, if you're new to Docker or if you are new to Docker on Windows, the Docker Desktop install recently has changed. I think it shows you a pop-up when you first install it asking you, do you want, it's like, I can't remember exactly how it's framed, but it's like, do you want Windows containers instead of Linux containers or something like that?
Yeah, exactly, because it always used to default to Linux because the very earliest releases. So, and that's one of the things that, going back to our kind of shared history, one of the things that I most liked about Docker, because I'd always worked with Windows professionally, but I had like you, I had a couple of Linux machines lying around. I was always interested in Linux, but I never spent enough consolidated time to kind of get happy with it. So when Docker came out, I was like, oh, this is great. I can read about this fantastic open source project, and I can do Docker container run, or Docker run back in the day. I don't have to go to the GitHub page and download a bunch of software and then follow some build instructions and then find it doesn't work. I don't do any of that stuff. I can just do a Docker run. And right from those early days, like Windows people were kind of along the journey. So Docker, with Docker Toolbox, they made pains to make Windows users welcome, which a lot of open source projects just didn't. So yeah, that was always really encouraging that Windows was seen as a first-class citizen, even when you couldn't have Windows containers. You couldn't run a Windows app natively in a container until the year 2016, and then Docker were working really closely with Microsoft to make that stuff happen.
Yeah, it's definitely it's one of those things where every time I talk about Windows and Docker, and I talk about or put it in a course or make a video about it, I always have to put in a disclaimer of, it's getting better all the time, and if I'm describing a process, it sounds like it's a lot of steps. It's probably, by the time you hear this, there may be a new release that has better support or better workflow. Because containers were invented on Linux, so it has a natural multi-year advantage in the ecosystem. Yeah. But I've always been shocked at how much Windows and how much Microsoft is putting into Windows, and even core kernel features and networking functionality and all this stuff to support Docker and Kubernetes and the container ecosystem. And they've not gone the route of sort of old school Windows that we all knew from decades ago of, let's invent a new thing and we'll call it Microsoft containers, and it'll be totally incompatible with everything else. And
exactly.
It's been great to watch them sort of say, well, Linux networking stack does this thing. Let's figure out how to plug that in on the Windows. Let's do it the Windows way, but let's make it compatible. And I've always loved that, Docker will put out an announcement and say, oh yeah, Swarm just kind of works with the overlay, networking on the latest, like some version of Windows with a certain patch. And I think that's really great. And I feel like we're closer than ever to, being a group of developers that can choose their host OS and then run whatever they want regardless of their host OS choice. Obviously, Windows containers only run on Windows. I mean, that's sort of a natural, something you would think that Microsoft is doing. But Microsoft's changing that, and we should maybe talk about that for a minute. Like, when you start to get into the Windows world, you typically start talking about .NET, right? And I had to learn a couple years ago the difference between .NET Framework and the .NET Core, or now I guess what they're just calling .NET, which is turning into Core. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so .NET Framework was the original .NET. Back in the old days when it was the Microsoft we're doing it our way, it was it was meant to be the answer to Java, really. It's going to be a run anywhere runtime. There's going to be multiple languages, so there's C#, there was VB.NET, Visual Basic .NET, and that was first released in 2002. So I mean, I started using it back then. So it was back in the day. I was working on really old IBM systems, and this new thing came along. And I thought, oh, that's really cool, and I've been doing it ever since. And so the .NET Framework was this. It's a runtime, so you install the .NET Framework, and then your app uses the runtime. So all the pieces to make it portable were always there, but it never really happened. And the .NET runtime you can build different types of application. You can build just console applications that sit in the background and do something. You can build web applications. There are different flavors of web framework that evolved over the years. As new technologies and new approaches emerged, they kind of got absorbed into the .NET framework. So when SOA was really popular, there was this piece called WCF, Windows Communication Foundation, that let you do some really neat stuff with SOAP. When REST got more popular, then that came in as well. And gradually, this thing that started off nice and neat got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it became just a big mess. Because if I wanted to write a Hello World application that had one line of code, I'd have to install 900 megabytes of .NET Framework to get it working. So that happened with .NET 3.5, and then they started to slim things down. And then they wanted to get to realize that idea that this should be a cross-platform thing, but it was just impossible because the .NET Framework had this by this point, almost 15-year legacy with integrating with Windows. It only ever ran on Windows. Different flavors of Windows, like you remember Windows CE and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
they had some level of .NET Framework support, but you would never run it on Linux or Mac, or that was never going to happen.
It was too tightly coupled, right? It was too tightly coupled with Windows to be able to be portable. Yeah.
And plus, there was almost probably no desire to get people off Windows and let them do
stuff.
And then everything changed. And I think Docker was involved in that, because suddenly I can write my Go application and I can package that to run on Windows or Linux. I can put it in a tiny container and I'm done. So I want to be able to do that with my my knowledge and my history of C# or whatever. And then .NET Core came about, and it's conceptually the same. There's a .NET Core runtime, but that is cross-platform. So I can run that on Linux, I can run it on Mac, Windows, I can run it on my Raspberry Pi, the latest version. And they started porting over a lot of the .NET APIs, and it's all been done in the open. So it's all open source. So the very first few releases of .NET Core were an experiment, really, of Microsoft being out in the open and having to have these sorts of discussions, fairly major architectural changes in the early days. And people, if you were following on like I was right from the beginning, it was painful because great things were changing all the time, and for each new release you just threw away everything you'd learned and start again. But now it's really solid. It's just coming up to the 3.0 release. Almost everything that you could do in .NET Framework you can now do in .NET Core, but they don't have all the legacy of all the stuff, so it's slimmer, it's more modern. Everything's super. So and that .NET Core, it's cross-platform. They publish it all on Docker images, and it follows that kind of the multi-stage Docker files that we've been telling people to do for years. It's completely in line with that. So there's a .NET Core SDK that you use in the first part of your build in your Docker file to compile your app. There's a .NET Core runtime for small apps, and there's an ASP.NET Core runtime, which is for web applications. So they understand. They've been working with containers so long. The images are highly tuned down. There's an Alpine version for Linux. There's a Windows Nano Server version for Windows. It's all really neat, and everything. It just all works as you would expect. And the transition from .NET Framework to .NET Core is feasible, but it's also not mandatory. So part of what we do when we go and talk to people with a big legacy Windows estate, they literally do have .NET Framework apps that go back 10 years, and no one's put any new features in them for 8 years. And all that happens is every now and then somebody has to log onto the box, do a Windows update, and hope that everything works. You can just take that app and run it in a Windows container, and that's fine. You don't have to rewrite it in .NET Core and move it to
Yeah.
Linux because all the Windows stuff is supported. If you're still working on that app and you're breaking features out, then yeah, you kind of get this position where the original big monolith starts to break up into smaller pieces. The new pieces are .NET Core that could run anywhere, and then like the monolith gradually sort of shrivels away. So that's what people are kind of doing there.
Yeah, and I think I love that summary. That there's a it's a common question, and I think it bears repeating that you don't have to migrate or convert or rewrite your app in .NET Core in order to use Docker. And I think I was actually at our meetup, our local Docker meetup last month, and locally we have 12 military bases in the area of Virginia Beach. It's one of the largest military areas in the U.S. and we get a lot of contractors, and the government loves .NET framework, Java, those sorts of enterprise level tools. So tons. Our .NET meetup locally is our oldest and probably our largest meetup of all the tech meetups. Bigger than the JavaScript one, I think, on average. So that group really cares about, what are they, the people that are coming out to meetups, they're typically the people that are looking to the future, right? Want to learn the new things. And a lot of them are, not so much worried, but concerned about the level of effort of like their future path for all of these legacy apps. And they keep getting told that Docker's the future, they got to check this out. But they're worried that it means rewriting stuff. And so usually one of the topics we end up having in the Q&A afterwards is around, oh, no, there's lots of options. There's at least two options. One of them is do nothing and just get your app, get your app to work in a container, and then it'll probably run on Windows Server fine. Yeah. And that, other basic little things like you don't write Windows GUIs in Docker, like because the .NET framework was so big, you could provide desktop apps, and that's not yet a thing that Docker's really meant for. Yeah. And then, .NET framework, or core, rather.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right there. So that process that I described with .NET Core, where Microsoft are publishing images with the SDK and the runtime, they do that for .NET Framework too. So those aren't cross-platform images because they only work on Windows, but they let you follow the same modern patterns. So all of your apps can have a Docker file which does the build, so the whole thing is portable. Docker Compose file, Kubernetes manifest, all that sort of stuff. So it doesn't matter how old it is; it just comes along. And it's a really nice way of having consistency across all your apps.
Yeah. And I think I've had some students that, for hobbyists, for traditional, Windows kernel built EXEs that we all think about. I have heard people talk about getting, command line and server binaries running on Docker Linux with Wine, but that's not really the the business way of getting those tools over to Linux. If you're interested in cross-platform, I don't know if your advice is the same way, but my advice has been, if you're interested in cross-platform, look at your projects moving to .NET Core, and like you said, pulling out little pieces of the monolith that you might have and slowly getting those cross-platform. It doesn't even mean you have to run them on Linux. You might want to stick with Windows to start with and have Windows containers running .NET Core, and then eventually, if you feel like that Linux gives you some sort of advantage or cost savings or whatever you can think up there. Is that kind of your advice?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work with people who all their operational experience is Windows. Like they want to get the efficiency benefits and the license cost savings from moving to containers, but they're not ready to make the Linux move yet. Like that's totally fine. Like you say, you can run a whole swarm that is 90% Windows nodes and 10% Linux nodes, and you can gradually put some of your new applications that are in Node or Java or whatever can live on those Linux nodes in your swarm, and the rest can all be Windows. And you may have a long-term roadmap that says, as we're breaking up these old applications, we're going to move bits to .NET Core. As we gain more and more confidence with Linux, we're going to move them and run them on our Linux nodes in our swarm. And gradually, your swarm goes from 90% Windows and 10% Linux to bigger and bigger. So you're using more and more of the Linux servers, and ultimately you're going to have just a handful of Windows servers running Windows containers for the apps you don't want to move. And as you break those things up, then they can just communicate across the whole swarm. So of course, and same deal with Kubernetes. It's newer in Kubernetes, but I can have my Windows components running in a container on a Windows server, talking to my new Linux components running on a Linux server. It's all seamless and all that stuff.
Yeah. In fact, that's a big thing this year, right? When we start talking about servers, is the Kubernetes Windows support GA? I'm trying to remember.
Yes, yes, GA as of all of a month ago, maybe 2 months.
Yeah. And Docker Enterprise, I believe, had a head start on that, right? They were working with the Microsoft team, and
Yes,
I
yes. So
remember.
we work closely with the Windows Server engineers, and we have done ever since they came to us and said, we want to do the Docker. Um, so the next release of Docker Enterprise will have support for Windows nodes in Kubernetes, and we're making it as seamless as possible. So I think the idea is going to be like when you join a node to your swarm, you can either join it as a swarm node or a kube node, and it'll be as simple as that. So you won't have to worry about the Kubernetes side of things of spinning up the kubelet and registering with the Kube API. That's all taken care of for you. So that's all super nice. The clouds, the two main clouds have Windows node support in preview. So you can go to Azure and you can spin up AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes service. And add Windows nodes to your cluster. Like I said, it's preview now, but it'll be GA soon. And it works in a very similar way to the way it works with Docker Swarm. That you have your application manifest, and there's just like a hint in there that says this particular part. So in Swarm, you'd say this service. In Kubernetes, you say this pod needs to run on Windows, and that's it. That's the only thing you do. So you can just add the bits of your application. You still describe them. You still package them with a Docker file. You still describe them with your manifest file. You just flag the bits that have to be Windows, and then you just throw it to the cluster, and the cluster manages everything in the same way.
Yeah. And for those that, there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of good stuff out there. But one of the things that, you work for Docker. I don't work for Docker. Nobody's paying me to say this, but my experience has been that if you are on Windows Server, and I used to be the guy 10 years ago running in a pure Windows team in the enterprise, like 15 sysadmins, and we were actually keeping Linux out, not because it wasn't cool. It was just all of our expertise was, we hired people specifically for Windows. So we had this excellent team up and down the stack from the hardware to the framework apps. Everybody we had storage experts, and they were all focused on Windows. So one of the cool things was the monoculture of that created a synergy where we didn't have to worry about 2 or 3 or 4 different OSs and have to have different experts that didn't understand the other parts. We really had everybody was certified, and it was a really great environment. I don't really think that most environments are like that anymore. If there's anything, Windows environments are getting invaded with Linux. But one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that Docker Inc. in particular has put a lot of effort into the Windows side of it, and I feel like they're really the leaders. So if you're out there and you're a Windows shop, you have Windows servers, and you're wanting sort of the best tools today, I feel like Docker Desktop, Docker Enterprise, they even got a Docker Desktop for Enterprise now. I feel like that whole product line is the best you can get right now on Windows. And in fact, I don't believe that Microsoft makes their own orchestrator for Windows. I feel like I don't know what their official statement is, but I feel like they're basically saying go get Docker Enterprise.
Well, yeah. So in Azure, then AKS is the thing.
Yep.
They have this product called Service Fabric, but it hasn't had a lot of investment lately because I think they focus on Kubernetes.
That's right. I forgot about that one.
Yeah. So I think I'm totally biased because I work for Docker, but I've used lots of different platforms, and Enterprise is certainly the best for Windows because it just works in the same way that you'd expect it to. And so we have a lot of clients now. So just to clarify that, so Docker Swarm has had Windows support for the last kind of 3 years. In year one, not everything worked in the same way with Windows, and gradually that's got better and better. And we're now at that stage with Kubernetes. So Windows support is in there, but not everything works in the same way with Windows pods as it does with Linux pods.
Right.
So Docker Enterprise gives you the choice. So a lot of our customers now, they may be running Swarm entirely through choice. They may have teams where on a single cluster, some teams are running Swarm, some teams are running Kube, and in that scenario, the teams who are publishing and maintaining Windows stack will be using Swarm, but with the opportunity to move to Kubernetes if they want to. So yeah, it's all. Right. And what I love about that, and I guess you have the same thing, Bret, that when you're teaching Kubernetes, It's just so complicated, and the learning curve is like this. So
Yeah.
I tend to teach Docker Swarm first anyway, because migrating to Q from Swarm is easier than starting from zero. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that there's someone else out there teaching it that way because, like my go-to conference in a month, shameless plug, it's my second attempt at a workshop that is you're gonna learn Swarm and you're gonna learn a little bit of Kubernetes and we're gonna talk about differences, pros and cons of each along the way, and of course, there's not a lot of people out there that have bothered to learn both at a level that they could probably teach it. So I respect that people, if they know that, bravo to you, because I have, it's been years now of just training myself, to prepare myself for the clients. And just last night, I was recording some new videos for our upcoming update to Docker Mastery on Kubernetes. And one of my challenges was at some point you have to stop. Like Kubernetes goes on forever. Like
absolutely,
you could fill whatever. Give me a block of time. Give me a year. Give me 2,800 hours or whatever it is. I will fill that with Kubernetes content, and it won't even go into the esoteric stuff. It'll be filled with just the storage drivers, the CS. I mean, it just, you name it. Networking providers, GUIs, third-party tools, monitoring, logging. It is endless. And so I think. One of the things I think I started talking about was I give people permission to not know everything, that you can't operate an enterprise Kubernetes environment alone. It's just too big of a thing.
Yeah.
You might be able to do that with Swarm. Yeah. It's just the difference is you're not going to have every possible feature you could ever want. That's the job of Kubernetes. Swarm is like the 80-20 rule. You get the 20% of features that 80% of people really need. And when you want to go to that, to those edge cases, I guess you could say, or just the highly complex enterprise environment, you're probably going to want to jump over to Kubernetes, but that's going to be a forever journey.
Yes, I have exactly the same thing because I do a workshop which is it's Docker for Windows people, and I start from zero and I do the .NET stuff and the .NET Core stuff and the breaking up your monolith and all that, and I'm adding Kubernetes into it. Shameless plug. I'm in Techorama in Belgium at the end of the month doing that workshop,
Nice.
and in that. It's a whole day workshop. I start from zero, and I include Swarm, and I include production readiness. And it's just a barrage of information. All the content's online, so it's all on. I can put it in here. I'll put it in the chat. It's all in. All the stuff's in GitHub. The presentations are all online, so you can go and repeat it yourself and get familiar with it. But I want to give people the full flavor of what this stuff looks like, so they can come back and they can bring it back and start bringing it into their enterprise. And in a day, you can give Swarm. A good enough covering to get people the core stuff. I'm going to add Kubernetes in there, and at the moment, I'm thinking I need to give Kubernetes no more than 90 minutes, and I'm not going to touch the surface.
I mean, all of this stuff, especially if someone's even new to containers, like I think at DockerCon every year, I do get people that come into my Swarm workshop, and they're new to Docker, and I generally say you can stay here, but it may not be the best use of your time, because if you don't know containers well enough to make them, right, to make images, and you haven't used them at least for a little bit, orchestration is not the first thing you want to learn, because I did have some consultants from a very large consulting company come out and to a presentation, and at the end of it, they're like, "This just seems like a product trying to find a market," or something like that. It's something that where they were like, "I don't get it," and I realized, because I was talking about orchestration, and if you haven't seen and caught on to the bug of containers itself, orchestration just looks like a problem looking for a solution, right? Or a solution, a solution looking for a problem, and a company making up a thing that they need to sell or something, and that because orchestration, if you look at that weird timeline, where Swarm Classic came out, Kubernetes came out, Swarm came out, Nomad came out, nobody, this stuff had not been invented before. No one had ever done this. And it all happened within a couple of years. And there was it wasn't like there was a grand conspiracy of companies saying, let's go make some products to sell. It was more like, we have everything in containers and this is the next hurdle. Like everything is super fast, except our management of servers and deployment to the servers is still very slow, painful, and a lot tedious, right? A lot of tedious work there. And so everyone kind of came up with these same ideas, different ways to implement the same idea at the same time was we need a bunch of servers and one command line to control them. And we need the servers to make decisions for us. We can't we can't expect admins to constantly make all these decisions all day about where should I run this, where should I run this one, and that's I feel like it's when the history books are written and there's the Netflix documentary special about containers, there will be an interesting segment where they talk about the overarching theme of orchestration, right? Let me go through some questions real quick. I'm actually going to scan the comments, but while I'm doing that, why don't you tell us about? I know you've got a bunch of links for people on all of you. You've got books, you've got conference workshops, you've got courses on Pluralsight. You're just everywhere, and someday I will have a fraction of your content on the internet. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about that? I'll let you share your screen.
Okay, let me. Here I'm. Where's the button? Because I'm not a particularly.
I know it's Skype.
User of Skype.
We're using Skype, and people go,
"Oh, here you are." So if you open the chat, it hides the button that you need to press. I'm a Zoom user, really. Okay, so let's share the screen. So if people are interested and I've got a whole bunch of stuff that I can go through. This is what a multi-stage Docker file looks like for .NET Core. So if you're familiar with this idea of multi-stage, here's the compilation stage. So I'm using an SDK that Microsoft produced. I'm copying my source code. The .NET publish command is what's going to build and publish my app. And then my application image is based on a runtime image, which is much smaller, just has what you need to run the application, copy the stuff in. So, that's when I was talking about portability, this is what I mean. Because if you want to build my application, all you need is my source code and Docker. Like, that's literally it. So if you're spinning up interesting new pipelines, like with GitHub Actions, and all you get is a Windows Server machine with Docker on it, that's all you need. Like, you don't need any prerequisites. You don't even need the .NET Framework or .NET Core. And talking about framework, let me see if I can find this. This is all the source code for my workshop. I'll give you the link to that in a second. This is what that looks like for an old, ancient .NET Framework application. Same deal. Microsoft published these SDK images. This is the latest one, which is 4.7.2. I'm doing the same thing. It's a little bit more evolved because there are a few more pieces in here, but I do the restore to get all the components my app needs. Then I do the MS build, which packages it up. And then the second stage, which is the final app stage, I'm using, again, it is an image which Microsoft own. They produce all the updates. When there's a Windows update every month, there's a new version of their images. I'm just copying in the published website, and that's all I need to do. But yeah, this is all the stuff that's on the workshop. If you go to this URL, which is dwwx.space, this is what I do in my workshops. But it's it's all there. So it starts from zero. It tells you what you need to do, and it gets you to the point of I don't know anything about containers. This is how this stuff looks, and then most of it is things that you copy and paste. So if you've never run a Windows container before, this is what you do, and it kind of walks you through that stuff. So this is the thing that goes on from zero through packaging your applications, .NET. Breaking up monoliths, a bit of Swarm, a bit of production readiness, enough for you to get a flavor of what all this stuff looks like through to the point of getting ready to production. So DW is the worst domain name you can think of. DWWX is meant for Docker Windows Workshop, and .space is the cheapest domain you can get. So that's there. All the code behind that is in GitHub. So if you follow any of these links, let me see if I can find a link. Well, if you keep going, eventually you'll find a link, and it will take you to my GitHub repo where all this stuff is. And I do a branch for every time I go to a conference to run the workshop, and then you'll find the particular version for the conference lives forever. So all that stuff's there. Give me two more. There we go. Here we go. There's a link coming up any second now. Oh, there's a link. Oh, I went too fast. Here we go. Docker file. This uses a JavaScript library that renders the slides, and it can be wonky. So yeah, click on any link, it'll take you to my GitHub repo, Docker Windows Workshop, where all this stuff is. Other links, so my blog, again, terrible domain name, blog.sixside.com. You'll get a link there to all my Pluralsight courses, the book that I did, which is just come out in the second edition. So this is all about Docker on Windows. It's a good book, but it's expensive. So if you don't want to buy it, email me and I will send you a PDF. I'm just elton@docker.com. All my Pluralsight courses are in there, all that sort of stuff. I've just started writing a new book. So my new book is called Learn Docker in a Month of Lunches. It's with Manning. Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? They do a series of them. So the idea is each chapter, there's about 20 odd chapters. You should be able to do a chapter in an hour and read it, and there's lots of hands-on labs. It's very, very kind of exercise-driven. The selling point for this is like everything I do in this book is cross-platform. So you can pick up this book and you can follow along with it with a Raspberry Pi or with your Windows 10 laptop with Windows containers, or a Windows Server machine in the cloud, or an Ubuntu machine. Like it's ARM, Intel, Windows, Linux. Everything works in exactly the same way, which makes it really hard for me, but really easy for the users, for the people who are kind of reading this stuff. And I've even got, here we are, this code here. I can't even read that out. Let's go back one. That will give you 40% off Manning, anything at Manning, and those are the other links I've got.
Very cool. Hold that up on the screen there for a second so people can check that out. And we'll put those links in the chat. But basically, going to his blog, blog.sixeyed, Sixeyed.
It's terrible.
Yeah, .com. No, it's cool. It's great. It's not the longest one. I mean, mine, you have to like spell out my name.
Yeah, but at least it's your actual name.
Yeah, but people put in 2 T's and they put a C in Fisher, so it's like, I don't know if that was ever really a good idea. I recently picked up Bret. A bunch of things like Bret.run and Bret.show, and but again, it's got 1 T in it, and people type 2 T's all the time. So I don't. Maybe I have to buy both. Maybe I have to squat like on everything.
You're gonna have 301s all over the internet.
Yeah. So. Well, very cool. There's so much to talk about in Windows. And before, so I want to have a whole segment where we just talk about the developer experience on Windows 10. But we actually have some questions, and I wanted to bring those up. We have some definite accolades there. Charlie's talking about he's grateful and thanks both of us. So he knows your work and is a fan. And then we have. I posted this up. Frank is also a fan. He said, good to see Elton on the show. His tutorials help me containerize my legacy .NET framework applications. So bravo. That's, I think the minute you get a .NET framework app, which traditionally, especially if you're talking about like an ASP.NET or something, once you get that running in a container on a server, and I feel like that's when you're truly hooked, because if you can get a sysadmin to just learn a little bit, and I'm a sysadmin, so we're slow, we're old, we don't necessarily adopt the latest things like developers always do, and if you can get them to if you can just take a Windows server, install Docker on it, tell them that, hey, by the way, this Docker Basic, which I think is the licensing level of the Docker Enterprise, it comes with Windows Server. We can actually use our Microsoft support contract to get help for it. And then, oh, by the way, here's just a couple of commands, and boom, it's running my .NET container. You don't need this really long install process and to move things into IIS and to copy things over and make up an MSI, or you don't need any of this stuff. I think that's when you'll start to hook your sysadmins. Is like, And when I give you a new version, this is only there's this one command you type. If you can get them on that, right?
Yeah, and that's what I do when I show a Docker file to people for the first time from their Windows background. So your old install document that was 30 pages long, that had all the little pictures that said click here, and it was all out of date and never worked. Forget about it. Now it's 10 lines of script.
Yeah. I mean, it was maybe 12 years ago. I was in an enterprise with 7,000 users, and our deployment guidelines included screenshots of MSI installers for servers. Like that. Yeah. That was the world we lived in, and I think it was. I mean, that was very. I would say that was probably even normal for Windows.
Definitely, Windows. Yeah, I'm not joking. I have written 30-page install documents with lots of screenshots, because we would give a 10-point guide to our admins, and they'd say, no, I want every single step documented, because I want to give this to an intern and know that they can do it. So every single screen had a screenshot with a little arrow saying, click this button. Don't click this button, type this in here. Yeah,
I know, right? It's like, copy this key, but you can't get this key here, so you go to this other place, get this key, copy it into, and you're on a server, and you're like, back before we had remote desktop, if you've been around that long, it was like, how do I get to the server? Like, I'm on the server, how do I get to this document on the server? I don't even have Word on a server. I'm standing at the console in the data center. You had to put everything in note. It was like, I feel like Windows has come farther in terms of the pain and suffering of deploying stuff in the data center than Linux, because Linux always had that, we're going to write some bash scripts. We're going to write some make files, and they had that programming background that, and Windows, I think that was really the biggest thing that, I was learning Windows back in the 90s, and I was in the Navy running Windows on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, and that was when I first had experiences on Windows NT. And it was an instant genius move, I felt like, because we were doing HP Unix, we were using Novell, NetWare, we were using all these different systems, but all of our machines were Windows. And like when we were sitting on our desktops, they were all Windows. And then suddenly there's now a server that looks just like my machine. And I feel like that decision alone, which was so counterintuitive to everyone else in the world really that was developing server operating systems, they said, "Hey, let's make this just like the machine they use all day," and it worked. I mean, like
Yes.
we all adopted it. It all it became very popular.
Yes, and we're still feeling the pain.
Right. But the side effect of that was Windows.
You can click and drag, but you can't automate that stuff.
Right. That's right. I guess that's the point. I should come full circle there. Is it's like, but that world was not designed for automation, so we have problems. I have a question here. So there's a question in from Docker on Windows support IP VLAN network driver. Do you know about that?
So I think the answer, it depends on what you're running, whether you're running whether you're trying to run a swarm or whether you're trying to run Kubernetes. I don't know I don't know for sure. I know there's a whole bunch of networking stuff that's going into Windows Server 2019 to support all the flavors of networking that you need in Kubernetes. So like Bret said, like the Windows networking stack before Docker was, it did this, and the Linux networking stack has always done that. And Docker took advantage of a lot of those pieces, and that had to come into Windows. Kubernetes is taking advantage of a lot more of those pieces, so Windows is still adding a lot of that stuff in. One of the biggest, we work with the Windows Server team, and some of the biggest effort in Windows Server to make it work with Kubernetes has been around the networking stack. So short answer, I'm not sure, but if it's a Kubernetes-y thing, then it's either on the roadmap or it's going to be in preview.
Yeah. I'm not seeing anything popping out on Google because I'm assuming the person has looked that up, just done a quick Google. But I see stuff on IP VLAN, I see stuff on Mac VLAN, but it's not Windows specific. So that's the thing about Windows containers is if it's talking about Docker containers and it doesn't specify Windows, it's probably assuming Linux. Like that's still kind of a thing. Is that there's a whole world of 3 or 4 years of work in Docker land that wasn't about Windows. So Windows is sort of the exception still.
Yeah, that's why you need a good book.
Yeah, that's why you need a good book on lunches. And another question from Biker. Even core is pretty large. Has Microsoft ever considered making something like a composer build version where you would include only the required DLLs rather than the whole Megillah, not the whole OS?
So you are in luck because with .NET Core 3, which is going to launch in a few weeks time, or no, next week, you can do exactly that. So you still have to sit if you want the .NET Core. You can build like you can with Golang. You can build a targeted executable for a given platform, and you can have that to be a slim exe. So you as a developer, I just include all the .NET Core SDK. I use the bits that I want to use, but when I publish it, there's a whole bunch of curious flags that you have to use in the .NET Publish command. But you will get that. You will get an executable file with only enough bits of .NET Core that you're actually using. So I don't know if you're going to get back to having a 50 kilobyte DLL, but you don't get anything you don't need.
So I don't think I wasn't really thinking about that. So so on Windows Server, today you have a choice on, and this is actually a question. You have a choice on how you package up your container. You can either have it running in basically a Hyper-V sort of environment that has, one of these minimal Windows OSs or the full Windows OS that's when people talk about these multi-gigabyte images, they're talking about that. But there's also another option, right? And what is that flag on the command line? I can't remember off the top of my head for running a...
So you're talking about the process isolation.
Yes. So process isolation, that essentially I think allows you to do like a scratch, right? Where you can start. No, you can't do a scratch.
You can't do scratch. So there are two things there. So firstly, the base image that you choose, you can't use scratch. It has to be either Windows Server Core, which is your multi-gig image. The reason it's a multi-gig image is because it gives you backwards compatibility for your 15-year-old app. So it's got all that stuff in there. Or you use Nano Server, and Nano Server is 100 meg. You can't run. It's not the full Windows API. So you can't run .NET Framework apps, but you can run .NET Core. You can run Java. You can run Go. You can run Node.js. So that's where you're going with your newer stuff. And then even though when people come to Windows containers from a Linux background, they go, oh, Docker run Microsoft / Windows Server Core, and it downloads these 2 gigabytes of stuff, and
Right.
they're saying, what is this? But it's the same. The architecture is the same. So that 2 gigabyte image is actually several image layers. They're all read only, and they get shared between everything else. So
Yeah.
it's a one-time thing, really. And that's the price you pay for having all that backwards compatibility. The process isolation stuff is slightly different. So that's the image size. I've got to choose either Nano Server or Windows Server Core or some derivation of that for my image. When I run my containers, I can either run them as Windows Server containers, which are just the same conceptually as Linux. They don't have C groups and namespaces in Windows, but they have similar concepts, so that when I run my container with process isolation, which is the default on Windows Server, then those processes run natively on my Windows machine. If I've got access to the machine, I can go and look at the task manager, and if I'm running 10 web server containers, I'll see 10 instances of ASP.NET. So the process runs natively on the machine. There's this other thing called Hyper-V containers, where the container it's still the same Docker API, so I still do a Docker run and all that sort of stuff. But when you spin up the container, it runs inside its own tiny virtual machine. They call it a utility VM, and that tiny virtual machine gives you an extra layer of isolation between containers. Now, it gets complex a little bit quickly, but the reason for having that is for like shared environments where you're running some software for your customers. So bring your own container image. I'll run it on my platform, but I have to expect hostile behavior. So by having my container wrapped inside this tiny VM, it's an extra layer of protection. So even if someone does find a hole in the Docker layer or in the Windows container subsystem, if they break out of that container, they're not on the machine. They're just inside this tiny little Hyper-V VM, which it just adds a little layer of protection between the containers. Unless you're in that kind of hostile environment, then normally you would use Windows Server containers, because same reason you use Linux containers. They're more efficient. You can cram a lot more work on, and they'll just share the resources of the machine. So yeah, that's the two different things there. The base image, either Windows Server for old apps or Nano Server for new apps. And then the runtime is either process isolation, which is the more efficient, or Hyper-V isolation, which gives you extra protection.
Yeah, and so I think that answers this question. And I mean, because I feel like a 100 meg image for Nano for process isolation that's not a big deal. Like,
no. I mean
who doesn't have 100 meg on a server, right? So I feel like that there's a difference between. Let me back up. This isn't a unique problem to Windows, like you're saying. If I want to do a Node app or a PHP app or anything where, like .NET Framework, it requires underpinnings of my code, not just my code itself. And I'm not packaging it in a binary that's a single little binary with all the dependencies built in. That's still a problem. Like Node, you get a default Node, and it's on Linux, it's 800, 700 meg, something like that. It's not small.
Yep.
So I feel like the difference we're talking about is between framework-based applications that are script languages that don't, bundle all of their dependencies, and then stuff like, like you're saying, .NET Core 3, that's pretty awesome. Go, everybody loves to talk about Go because it can do that static binary. And adding 100 meg to simply get Windows support for that Nano image, I think that's fine. I mean, at that point, I feel like I don't really need Scratch, because I'm not there's not as many Windows IoT devices out there where you have to worry about 100 megs on a flash card or something like that. Like that's a pretty distinct problem to Linux. I know we've had Windows CE and stuff in the past, but those things still come with lots of RAM and at least a hard drive in them. So, all right. So we've got this whole other topic on Windows development, especially like WSL2 and doing stuff on Windows 10. But before we kind of dive into that, I wanted to get through some more questions. Let's see. Biker is saying, we had a lot of trouble with Windows nodes in Azure. Docker Enterprise doesn't seem to play well with Swarm. Perhaps just an Azure problem, as we've had issues with Azure Linux too. Okay. Interesting
So
experience.
yeah. So the so Docker Enterprise works fine on Azure, and if you follow our Docker certified infrastructure thing, which spins you up the whole cluster, then it spins you up a cluster configured such that you shouldn't get any issues. I suspect the problems you're describing are about the networking layer, and obviously the cloud networking layers are different from just having a bunch of Cat6 cables plugged into machines. There's a lot more indirection and virtualization in there. So I would hope that what you're saying is just to do with the networking between the machines, because I run all my stuff on a Docker Enterprise stack in Azure. My blog runs on that. Anytime I do any demos, it all runs on that stuff.
Yeah.
And I haven't had any kind of problem. So I suspect it's to do with the setup. If you look at Docker certified infrastructure, which we recently released, which has support for AWS, VMware, and Azure, and we're adding more. It's basically it's a nice little way of spinning up your cluster with all the best practices. It generates all the right components for the relevant target. So, like in Azure, it'll get you a scale set for your machines. It'll set you up your load balancers. It'll set you up your public IP addresses. It'll do all the rules for the load balancers and the firewalls and that sort of stuff. So that's the way to do it. If you're kind of hand rolling some of this stuff, then you're getting to the level where you're mixing the complexity of running containers itself with the complexity of your particular cloud, and you might end up with with issues.
Yeah, he's saying he was giving more information. Calico, which I thought Calico was only a Kubernetes thing, but he mentioned Swarm, so I'm not really sure.
Well, yeah.
How
If
Calico
you're
would.
using Docker Enterprise with Swarm and Kubernetes, then yes, you'll be using Calico for the networking layer. So Kubernetes is different because with Docker Swarm, the networking is built in. Overlay network just works between the nodes. With Kubernetes, you have to bring your own pod network, and there are different implementations. And as far as I know, the main one, so Calico, I think is still in beta. We're working with Tigera, who do the enterprise version, to get that all kind of certified, ready for our next release of enterprise. There's Calico, there's a couple of others, and I think that they're all still kind of flagged as beta. So if you're talking about Kubernetes, then I'm not entirely surprised that you're getting networking issues. But having said that, there is a working path, because you can do it with Azure Kubernetes service. So when you spin up an AKS cluster, all the kind of networking stuff is all taken care of for you, and that does work. So there is a route to getting it working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the networking part is, one of the biggest challenges too. Also, just getting all of the components of a container orchestrator to work with all the things in the cloud, like the specialized cloud storage, the specialized cloud load balancers. I mean, it's not like it can't be done, but that's a point of friction because everything's different and everything evolves at different paces. Clouds upgrade their stuff before necessarily, third-party companies do. So I've had people in the past with any container solution talking about the challenges with keeping up with the cloud vendor, because the cloud vendor may not be updating their container components as fast as they update the rest of their stuff. But I think that's a diminishing problem because they're all realizing that like the future for them is containers as well. So I think in early days it was more common that it wasn't necessarily front and center for them to worry about a storage driver for Rexray or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's another question here. It's actually a pretty good one. Can you share any observations on running Windows and Linux containers in a single compose file or swarm in experimental mode? Swarm in experimental mode.
Interesting. So, experimental mode is basically an opt-in for newer features. I don't think there's much in the way of Swarm, which has the experimental flag. If I can I share my screen?
Yeah.
Let me do that again. So, where am I? Display to share screen. Okay, so that's my let's get my password manager off the screen there. So the compose file format is exactly the same. It's one compose file format for Windows and Linux, and when you're in your swarm. If I have a look at this is an example. This is all on the workshop stuff. So this is a Windows only swarm, so there isn't anything different about this stuff apart from some of the nuances to do with the Docker engine itself when you're trying to mount the engine inside a container. But the format's the same, all the words are the same. When it gets interesting is you can have if you're running in a mixed mode, So I've got a mixed cluster of some Linux and some Windows nodes. Then you want to put in these placement constraints. So this is an example. This will tie this particular container to a manager, but I can put in here to say that the platform should be Windows, or I can put in here to say the platform should be ARM if I've got a mixture of ARM and Intel machines and I want this to run on ARM. So literally that's all that changes. So I don't know if you do the same, Bret, but I tend to talk about having compose overrides. So I've got a core definition here, which is all the main parts of my application, and this is the same for everyone. And then I've got a dev override, which fits in bits and pieces that work for me as a developer on a single machine. And then I do Docker compose up, and I pass it both those files. And then I've got a production override, which does the stuff that I care about for my cluster. So this has got my placement constraints. It's got the number of replicas I want to run. I'm using configs and secrets and all that sort of stuff that I get from the swarm. And with these, I join these two together to get a single stack file, and that's what I deploy to my swarm. So yeah, I've gone off on a tangent there, but this is how you do it. And it's the same in Kubernetes. Same principle is the same in Kubernetes. I've got a Kubernetes manifest here. So I've got I've started a little repo on GitHub just called Kate-Win, which has got some information about how you can set up a development environment for Kubernetes when you're working with Windows containers as well. And inside there, I've got some sample manifests migrating the same application that I use in my workshop to run on containers in Kubernetes. So I'm using a SQL Server database. I'm just using Microsoft's Linux SQL Server database when I deploy this. And again, I've got the same idea, which is telling the orchestrator that this should be Linux, because the orchestrator can do both, and I want it to make sure it lands on the correct node. So this node selector is how you do that in Kubernetes. And then my web application, which is my .NET 2 app. Same deal. I've got all the bits and pieces that you need for Kubernetes. And at the bottom here, this is a Windows component. So same thing conceptually. When these run, my database pod will be on a Linux node. My Windows pod will be on a Windows node. But they're still going to use DNS, and they'll use the pod network to talk to each other. So it's the same Docker images. I haven't changed anything about the images. I'm just using a different manifest format to describe them. And the Kubernetes manifest is obviously 4 times the size or whatever. But that's how you do the thing. Same principle. I want to be able to tell the orchestrator that, yes, you're going to choose where to run this, but it should be, it should match this architecture, which would be Linux or Windows.
Right. And Charlie was mentioning that he was saying experimental mode because that's what you have to enable to run both Windows and Linux on the same machine.
Okay. So we're not quite there yet, but we will soon be at the point where you can do that with hopefully. I better not commit to anything that the product team won't be happy about. But we would like to get to the point where Docker Desktop on Windows, you can spin up a hybrid swarm or a hybrid Kubernetes cluster. So that may happen with the WSL work that's coming through, WSL2, which gives us that really nice Linux subsystem, where potentially I would run my Kubernetes master in a pod on WSL2, and I could run and I would join my native Windows machine as a node to that master. So I've got I've got a hybrid Kubernetes cluster or a hybrid swarm cluster on one machine. We're not there yet, but I think that's definitely where we'd like to be. Because right now, especially for Kubernetes, I mean, you can have a single node swarm in Windows. That's fine. So if I'm a Windows developer and I want to see what this stuff looks like in the cluster, I can run a single node swarm and just spin it all up. If I'm running Kubernetes, you can't do that. So you have to have Linux nodes for the master, which is where you get to this point of, I'll stop sharing my screen, I'll share it again. You get to this point where, like in the bad old days, if you want to do a bunch of development, and Kubernetes worker and a Windows worker, and it's, there's quite a lot of words there, and most of those words just tell you to run scripts that have got a huge amount of stuff in them. So, Flannel is the other one. So Flannel is the other network, pod network that supports Windows. That's also in beta right now. But so I don't even think we're talking about Kubernetes, but I've gone on to Kubernetes now. Bear in mind we're at kind of early stages here. So when I'm talking to customers about, we want to move to Kubernetes because that's what everyone's doing, then I would say, if you're new in your Docker journey and you've got Windows components, then I would stick with Swarm, like probably for the next 6 months. And then, you're not going to waste any effort. If you're new to containerizing your apps, you're going to be writing your Docker files to get your images. You're going to be writing your compose files to piece those pieces together. If you're ready to move to Kubernetes at some point, you're just going to take your compose file and make it look like a Kubernetes manifest. Or you can, we have this component that you can install on Kubernetes. So you just send Kubernetes a compose file, and it works all out for you. So it's not wasted effort, but I think at the moment, if you're heavily in Windows and you're just kind of toying with the idea of containers, it's probably a bit too early to go all in on Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just actually recorded a little video last night about Compose on Kubernetes, which is a Docker repo that essentially in Kubernetes runs as a container in Kubernetes and then gives you the functionality to use the Docker file to not the Docker file, the Docker command line to deploy using the stack deploy command. So if you're familiar with Swarm, you can use that same Docker stack deploy command or Docker app now, I believe, the new Docker app command, to use the compose file on a Kubernetes cluster, and it's converted essentially to the API spec in real time. So you don't necessarily have to make those manifests. If you love the workflow that Docker's laid out for development all the way through production with a single YAML file format, and you can stick with, inherently, if you think about it, compose is a naturally simpler syntax with less options than the entire universe of Kubernetes API. So obviously there's a compatibility, and that repo shows all of that compatibility. So you can sort of figure out, can we do everything we want to do in Kubernetes with our compose files already, or are we going to need to actually make actual Kubernetes manifest? And it's a pretty neat option. That's not going to work for everyone. It's not necessarily what the ops teams may always want, but I had this idea last night that you could feasibly have a scenario where, and I don't know if anyone's doing this, but you could have a Kubernetes cluster. Let's say you're only Kubernetes, you're not even Swarm, but all of your developers are Docker on Docker desktop. They're all using the Docker workflow locally, and they're all using Compose because that's been the nice, easy tool locally. They don't want to run necessarily Kubernetes locally, or maybe they do, but they don't have to. They like that Compose YAML format. And then you have this ops team. Let's say you have an ops team that they would prefer on their Kubernetes clusters to use Helm, right? Or use something that's already templated YAML for the Kubernetes manifest and APIs. But that doesn't mean they have to be exclusive one or the other. As at least the way I'm looking at it, you could technically have that Compose on Kubernetes running on the cluster. So a theory I came up with, I don't know if anybody's doing it, is maybe your ops team is using Helm and other tools for all their infrastructure stuff, right? The really complicated stuff, the databases, and because in a lot of enterprises, you're not running a database per app. You're usually running centralized databases and large systems. And then when your developers show up and they say, "Hey, look, I've got some new, .NET Core apps," or maybe that's a bad example, maybe just Linux apps, whatever, and I've already got my Compose. The ops team doesn't have to say, "Okay, well now I've got to make a manifest file for this, and I've got to manually convert it." They can just say, "Hey, look, we've already got the Compose. It looks legit, like it could work, or maybe with some subtle changes, we're going to deploy it with that override file or something like that." And they can use that Compose on Kubernetes for their homegrown apps, and then still use Helm and all the advantages of the pre-built, the new operator pattern stuff and all that. I don't know if anyone's doing that, but it seemed like a legit idea for checking the boxes, right? Operators get full control, the things they care about. Developers get, their smooth workflow for a single YAML file, or at least a single core YAML file that they don't have completely different YAML languages in there.
Yeah, absolutely. That would work really a nice clean delineation for, I'm using Helm for all the third-party stuff, where the publishers are going to publish me a Helm chart, and our own applications don't need the horizontal pod auto-scaling stuff. So I can just capture everything I need in the Compose file. I've been using that Compose on Kubernetes lately, actually. I've been trying it out on all the clouds, so deploying it to make sure it works on AKS and GKE, and it just works. And it covers the main stuff. So you can do configs in there, you can do secrets in there that map to the Kubernetes config maps from the Kubernetes secrets. It works really nicely.
And in case you're listening, and this is in the audio only format, this is called Compose on Kubernetes. I'm going to throw it up on the screen real quick. It's at github.com/docker/compose on Kubernetes with dashes in there. And Docker open sourced this last year. it was built in a Docker desktop for a while, so you could do this in Docker desktop for probably at least a year or more. And then they open sourced it last year at DockerCon. And what's nice about it as well is they have instructions because it runs on top of Kubernetes, and it's sort of like an API proxy almost. At least, not sure how you would define it, but it's got docs on all these common formats: AKS, EKS, JKE. Running even on Kind, Micro, and Minikube, all the local options there. So you're not forced to use this with only Docker Desktop and Docker Enterprise. If you have Kubernetes already and you are using Compose locally for development and you would like to try this out, it's totally open source. Check it out. They've got docs on installing in all the places. So like we said, it's got compatibility and architecture stuff in there. So you can go through and they basically tick the boxes for what features in Compose translate to Kubernetes and which ones don't work. Like what things can you do in Kubernetes you can't do in Compose, and back and forth. It's pretty cool. Definitely check that out if you're a shop that's interested in what I would call the Docker way of developer workflow for containers, which is largely about Compose, right?
And that whole thing, you can automate the whole deployment. So I've been working on GitHub actions that spin up an AKS cluster. The action goes and deploys Compose on Kubernetes, and then when you push code, it takes your Compose file and deploys it to AKS. You can automate the whole stuff. It's actually really neat.
Yeah. I have I need to get on a plane soon because I have all this reading on GitHub Actions because everybody's starting to write all this stuff now, right? Like in the Kubernetes Weekly this week, they put in a thing about doing Kubernetes, basically GitOps, it sounded like, from GitHub Actions. And that's where I get super excited because CI/CD is great when you really, really need it. But in so many small environments, especially ones that are new to continuous deployment and things like DevOps and GitOps, those teams don't necessarily need to do that. And this was a conversation from last week, actually. We had two guys from CloudBees that make Jenkins on, and we were talking about Jenkins versus Jenkins X and how Jenkins X is basically the only thing that they have in common is that they're CI/CD products and they have the same name. But other than that, they're completely different, and that Jenkins X is a small subset of what you can do with Jenkins itself, but it's designed for that automated workflow. And I feel like GitHub Actions, it's basically Microsoft getting into the CI/CD game again.
Microsoft is GitHub.
Yeah, exactly. That Microsoft's got so many different CI/CD tools over the years, or at least CI tools, especially if you're code tracking, team, foundation server, all these Swarm, Source Safe. If you go back long enough, they've got lots of different products. Yeah.
Hey, let me show you very, very quickly because I know we're already well over time. Let me show you. So let's display too. So can you see this is a GitHub repo that actually this was generated from a Docker template. I've been using stuff with Docker templates. In the .github folder where the workflows are, everything's just a YAML file. So each of these is a workflow that can be created by something happening. So in this case, I've got this is gonna, when somebody pushes to my repo and the push contains a file, which is actually this file, then it will kick this off, and all it does is run a container. So all it does is runs a container and it sends it in a bunch of secrets which are captured in GitHub. And this is going to create me an AKS cluster. So it's going to create me a Kubernetes cluster in Azure. And the interesting thing about this is in the settings, I've got these secrets here and I can't read them. So as an admin, I can set up the repo. I can put all the secrets in there for all the Azure automation, all the Docker Hub stuff, and then developers can go and work on their actions. And they use the secrets without ever having access to them. So that's really neat. So when with this particular example, it spins up AKS, it spins up Cosmos DB, which is an Azure database, and then on every push, it does this bit here, which is a stack deploy. And again, it's all just containers. It does a Docker Compose build and a Docker Compose push to push my actual parts of the app. And then because I've got this dependency for my Cosmos database, it runs a container which fetches a connection string. It saves that connection string as a secret in my Kubernetes cluster, which is pretty cool. And then it uses Compose to Kubernetes to deploy my application. So my Compose file, which again is in the same repo, my Compose file is expecting to, I've got a production Compose file that is expecting to find a secret. and that secret is populated by the GitHub action, which fetches it from Azure and saves it in Kubernetes. So like these things are really neat, and it's just tiny bits of YAML. You don't have to use containers, but if you do, then suddenly you've got containers that do all your bits and pieces, and you just tie them together.
That's pretty great. I'm There's not a lot of stuff out there because not everybody's had access to GitHub Actions, but now I believe, I think all you have to do is opt in. Like you have to ask now. Everybody can get it if they want.
I don't know. I got in because of my friends at GitHub.
Yeah, yeah, you got people. I think I read yesterday that it's not technically default to everyone, but I got invited in like a month ago, and that if you ask or if you go and sign up on the form or whatever and opt in, you basically get in. So if someone's looking at wanting to do that, because I've had that question several times over the months, is, hey, can you hook me up? I'm like, I got no people.
I got nothing.
I'm just a Docker person. I'm not a everything on the internet person. All right, so some more great questions. I think we should jump to WSL2 because we've hinted at it, and I feel like that deserves a conversation, even though we are running a little long. But hey, you know what? It's the internet. If we're still talking and we're still hanging out, like, it's all good. Charlie's asking another question. He's got some great questions today about any prospects on running Docker on WSL2. Many will be reluctant to go and basically do the insider preview, which is a Windows OS beta build of Windows 10, just to be able to try it out for now.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, you can. Like it's if you look at the Docker engineering blog, which is a relatively new thing, so it's dockerengineeringblog.com or something like that. We've got people who've been doing that stuff. So we had a very early access to WSL2. We got Docker up and running on that, and we were looking at that for the next evolution of Docker Desktop. So there won't be a VM to run your Linux containers. It will be WSL2. It's super neat. Like it's really good. It's pretty close to being like production quality, but we have a hard dependency on WSL2, and like you, I'm not entirely keen on having my daily production machines running an early insider preview. So, we will make that happen as soon as it goes to the wider public. We will do a release of Docker Desktop. How we do it, I'm not sure. Whether it's going to be smart enough to say you've got WSL2, so we'll use that, and if not, we'll use Hyper-V. But ultimately, like we definitely want to do it because at the moment we have to manage that Hyper-V VM, we have to do all that stuff, and we kind of won't need to. We'll just have the Docker engine running in WSL2, which will just be stock Docker engine. So yeah, it's going to happen. It's going to be very cool. We can't accelerate it for you. Like it's when it comes out in Windows. If you're not comfortable with the insider, then you're just going to have to wait.
Yeah. That's the thing. This tech is really, really cool, and I'm excited for it. We're just not used to getting Microsoft to throw out a beta of some significant new advancement in Windows almost a year ahead of when they plan to actually launch it. So, if they hadn't told us for 6 months, we all wouldn't be sitting around going, "How do we make this work now?" But it's one of those things where you can be careful what you ask for. They're releasing things in preview earlier, but that also means that we now know of a thing that will exist. We just don't want to have to wait the 8 months or whatever it was going to be. Because when it came out, everybody was talking about it in my Docker community and my Slack for all my courses, and everybody's chit-chatting about it in there. And I was saying, well, you do realize it's going to be, they said like 2020, so we at least 8 or 9 months before we can expect this in a Windows update that we can all get without going insider preview. So don't, it's cool to go check it out, and bravo to Docker for getting out this update on the Edge cycle for this. This is really neat. Is it on Edge or is it a separate download? I don't know if you just said that.
So like I said, I'm not a fan of running inside a preview, so I haven't tried. I've seen it in action. I haven't tried it myself. I think it's a separate thing still.
Yeah, I have. I'm able this year on my Mac. I run Parallels as my virtualization, and
the best of all the virtualization.
I love Parallels. VMware Fusion's fine, and it traditionally has worked well with Docker. But this year, I've got Docker for Windows to work in a VM in Parallels on a Mac, and I now have one that's dedicated WSL2 with the insider preview. Just so I could check out WSL2 because I was super excited, and it's exactly as everybody keeps saying. It's super fast. They don't have all the bits yet, so like the the file mounting feature set that's going to be better than the network sharing we had before. Is going to be better. And I don't know if you saw on the captain's channel, but we were talking when it first came out. One of the Docker engineers was in there saying that, this preview is fine, but it's going to get way better. Like we already have plans to integrate the storage better so that it's just it just works, and you don't have to think about this whole my Linux file system versus my Windows file system and which one's which and what the path is going to be and all that. So yeah, I'm excited. I want it to be here tomorrow, but at least we know that there's tons of people working on it, and it's one of those things where we won't probably have to wait. No guarantees, but we probably won't have to wait very long after the Microsoft announcement of the new WSL2 before we see Docker throwing out some cool stuff. Because I think a lot of people on Windows are looking for ways to make Windows, Docker, and cross-platform development just easier. And Microsoft clearly knows that, because for them to come out with WSL2 only a few years ago, and then it essentially completely can change out the architecture just in a couple of years later, when people are just running WSL1 all day long. Like everyone I know on Windows that's doing Docker development is running WSL at some point. It's just a natural extension of them. Oh yeah, I'm a developer on Windows. I'm definitely going to use WSL. So I'm glad we're getting even more feature set there, and it's pretty cool stuff. So, is there a site? Is it beta? Didn't you say? I don't know if you said that or not. Beta.docker.com.
I don't actually know where so there was an engineering blog that went out this week or last week with an update of what WSL2 is doing.
It's on beta. So beta.docker.com. You can sign up for the preview Docker desktop for WSL2. But yes, like Charlie was mentioning, that does require that you basically insider preview your Windows machine, which essentially turns it into a beta. I warn you that I have been bitten by the betas of insider preview. It's definitely beta. The tech previews are definitely beta. So definitely don't do this on your production machine. And if you have to make money on that machine, or you have to do work for a company on that machine, probably should put it in a VM. But a lot of people work in a VM every day, so it's feasible that you get it to work and inside a virtual machine, and you get to experience the awesomeness of WSL2. All right, so let me look at any other questions we have here. Charlie's asking again about the IIS image size. Is there any way to shrink the IIS image size? But I feel like we've kind of answered that, right? That you can't.
So if you look at the image size between Windows Server 2016 and 2019, that they reduced it from 6 gig to 2 gig by removing Windows features. There are presumably a few more gains to be had, but I don't think if you want full Windows Server that can run full IIS, that can run your legacy ASP applications, you need a lot of Windows behind that, and I don't think they're going to get that much smaller.
Yeah. I think we're in the situation of diminishing returns over time. I mean, the same can be true. If you look at all the images, like just Linux images, they even like Ubuntu, just in the last few years, it keeps getting smaller. But the big advancements in shrinking these things was like 3 or plus years ago. Like that's when it went from 200 plus meg down to 180, and then it kept shrinking from there. So I don't expect us to go suddenly from 150 or 120 meg down to 5. Like we're not going to turn into Alpine or anything like that. So I think a lot of companies have spent a lot of time on this, and the way I understand it, the last thing I heard on the rumor mill was that Windows teams had outsourced to a bunch of overseas engineering teams to basically walk through all the code of basically every system in Windows to try to figure out what can we pull out, what can we pull out, what can we get rid of, what do we don't need. Like look at the system hooks, and do we need that in here? And basically going DLL by DLL to figure out what can they not break and pull out. And I think for some of us also at a totally different topic, it was sad to hear that Nano is no longer a full operating system. But
Yes, well, that was they're doing a lot of interesting new development in public, and they are listening to a lot of how this stuff gets used. So the original conception for Nano Server was, I want to run some flavor of Windows on bare metal, and I'm only going to use it for containers. And it kind of turns out people didn't. A lot of the people who were getting into Windows containers needed to run Windows Server Core to get to get the runtime for their older applications. So they weren't using Nano on bare metal, and the install base was tiny. And by making it a container-only OS, they could cut an awful lot of stuff out of it. So that's why Nano Server went from 1 gig to 100 meg, because it doesn't need a PS2 driver to support someone plugging in a mouse, because it's just a container.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm while you were talking, I was looking up GitHub Actions, because we're getting people asking in chat about the GitHub Actions and Docker stuff, and there's not a lot out there yet. So that's probably an opportunity. If sometimes we have Docker captains on the chat, but if there's any on there today, I'm sure Elton's busy, so I'm not going to ask him to go make this demo. But show an example of taking GitHub code and automating a deployment, like automating a build and an image push and a deployment, if that's even possible in Actions, because I have very little experience with them other than just like watching other people's videos. I just got into the beta weeks ago, so I haven't had a chance to play with it. I'm really curious in that, because, I mean, again, it's not going to be anytime soon a full CI/CD solution, but if for these, I have people that say, hey, look, I've got a personal project, I'm running it on Docker Swarm, 3 nodes. I'd love to be able to have automated deployments and builds that don't require me to also have this other product somewhere else. And I would love to be able to point them to a walkthrough, a tutorial, or a tool that says, hey, really all you need is Docker Hub, GitHub, and your Swarm. And these things just, it's GitOps all day long. You put commits, certain branches, they go to the server. Services get updated. And we've seen some stuff out there, but with GitHub Actions, I feel like we're now we're getting closer to the dream.
Yeah, definitely. So unfortunately, I spent Monday recording the exact video you're talking about, and I can tell you it is super slick. But at the moment, we've only shared it with a few people. So if it goes public, I'll tell you. But right now, you just take my word for it that you can do it. It's excellent. Yeah, I'll show you the video, Bret. But I don't know if we can go public yet.
So yeah, don't tell me. I might just tell the world. So. This is we've gone on. We might be breaking close to the record. I feel like we're in record-breaking territory on.
I think the whole audience left.
Yeah, no. We've got. I can tell you, we got 22 people live right now. We've had hundreds of people, and there's definitely a lot of interest for this. So we've had lots of people in the live stream. We've had it's 180 people on the show so far. So it's definitely a huge amount of interest, and I think it spans, like, we've gone through like everything from local development. We didn't even go into like using Visual Studio Code to to hook into your container and running with all the new plugins for Visual Studio Code. That's really making it great to run containers for development and make it an even smoother experience if you're going to consider using that as your editor. That area, I continue to be amazed at what things are showing up in Visual Studio Code as plugins to automate and make things easier for developers. I mean, I'm a Vim person, but I feel like I'm in a substandard situation because all this cool stuff is showing up.
Well, if you're a Vim person, you've been thinking about that for years, surely. But VS Code is astonishing, and it went from nothing. Like, in a couple of years now, like every single demo on every conference ever, they're using VS Code. Yeah,
people that don't have anything to do with Windows, the OS, or Visual Studio, the original full-fledged IDE, are showing up. When I see someone on Linux showing Linux containers and a demo. And they're Linux on their desktop, and Linux is their server, and they're using Visual Studio Code to do stuff in containers and develop stuff. That's when I'm like, this is saturated the market. And I think Stack Overflow had some statistics from their latest stuff this year that how high of percentage of people using Visual Studio Code coming from nowhere, out of nowhere, supplanting IDEs that have been around for decades. So we haven't even talked about that, but I feel like that could be a whole other show. I think last month we did some stuff, Ray and I on the show, just showing how we set up our IDE and shell environments for development in containers and whatnot. And but there's so much there, and the code pairing and the development in containers and all that stuff you can automate there. There's a lot to it. So we're gonna have to come up again on the show and talk about that.
Let's just schedule a whole day.
We schedule a whole day. We go live streaming on Twitch for 24 hours nonstop Docker. Like at about hour 4, there's gonna be crickets in chat, and we're gonna be sitting here like, I need another Red Bull. Well, thanks again for being on the show. I'm going to remind you all that Elton's got tons of stuff out there. So let me just remind you with some URLs. He's got Manning books, including a new one. So you can get 40% off that stuff using the code PODDOCDEV19, PodDocDev19. That'll get you the discount. You can get his blog. You can get him on Twitter. His Twitter handle's right there in the screen. Elton Stoneman right there. And his blog, which we've mentioned multiple times on the show, has everything. That's right. You got to point to it. It's hard to point when you're looking in the camera.
Yeah.
And you can, of course, find him in the Docker community chat. He's in there. He's at the conference near you. He's going to be traveling to Europe. Well, he's living in Europe. I'm traveling to Berlin next month. And when are you going to be in? Is it Barcelona?
I'm in Amsterdam at the end of the month. I'm in Poland next month, and I'm in Lithuania the month after. So I've got a bit of travel coming up. All great conferences.
All Docker, all day long. So even more Docker than myself. So thanks so much for being on the show. I'm looking forward to seeing you again, whether it's the next DockerCon or the next Docker Summit, maybe in Europe, or some other random conference that we get to high-five each other at.
Yeah, sure.
And for everyone watching, thank you so much for being on the show. Again, we will be back here next Thursday doing the same thing. Maybe another guest. Maybe it'll be just me. You're just going to have to subscribe and click that little bell to get notified to find out who's going to be on the show and get your questions answered. And thanks for seeing us on YouTube Live. See you again next week.